What can you say about Gran Turismo? There are few names in the racing genre that ring out as far and as wide, and for good reason. The series has been a household name for more than a quarter century, and I would say that it is, by far, the most prized remaining feather in Sony's exclusives cap. Even if you've never owned a Gran Turismo game, you've likely played one, or watched someone playing one thanks to its widespread appeal. Gran Turismo isn't just a fun racing game, it's a celebration of car culture and history. It's a landmark series that has been a leading influence on the entire genre, whilst stoking the fire of motorsport passion for generations of rev heads and gamers alike. But screw all that. I'm a PC gamer and I play iRacing, goddammit. As an esteemed member of the illustrious PC Master Race, I scoff at your surfish ways as I bask in the glory of my $12 cars and $15 tracks that look like they're from an Xbox 360 game, which I gladly pay a subscription fee for the privilege, nay, honour of using. You wouldn't understand. It's all about the realism of the simulation, something a console peasant wouldn't recognise if it hit them in the face. So why am I making this video? Well, allow me to drop the caricature, wind things back, and I'll explain myself. I don't have a super extensive history with Gran Turismo. I remember playing a bit of GT2 and 3 when visiting friends back in the early 2000s, and I later owned GT4, but I didn't play much of it. In 2011, I went balls deep into PC gaming, which became my platform of choice ever since. In 2017, thanks to a 2Clicks Phillip video, I was introduced to Dirt Rally, which was a revelation. It showed me just how satisfying and rewarding it could be to drive a car that actually behaved somewhat realistically, and I loved it. This prompted me to explore other simulators like Assetto Corsa and Project Cars 2. But for whatever reason, at that time, they didn't click for me, so I put them aside and I stuck to rallying. Fast forward to early 2023, I hadn't owned a console for 12 years, so I impulse purchased a PS5 and Gran Turismo 7, and I've got to say, I really liked it. There was something really appealing and enjoyable about the way it teaches you to drive on circuits with the license tests, and the way the Cafe Career mode guides you through different eras, brands, and categories of cars. The game had an earnest enthusiasm that was strangely wholesome and infectious. I resumed experimenting with more sims again on the PC, bought myself a direct drive wheel setup during Black Friday, made my YouTube channel to document the journey, and then in the new year of 2024 I signed up for iRacing, and now here I am. Ultimately, I credit Gran Turismo 7 for getting me into circuit sim racing, and I continue to enjoy it when I want something a bit more casual, but I've never touched the multiplayer. I thought it might be interesting to see what I think of it now that I have a year of iRacing under my belt. The reason for this preamble is that I'm acutely aware of the angst-ridden tribalism that infests the gaming world, and the resulting poor optics of a big bad PC elitist coming along to dunk on your favourite game and take your lunch money. I just want to assure you that I'm going into this as open-mindedly as possible, and as an existing fan of GT7 single player. So, let's get on with it. I jump into the sport page and I click on the daily races, and I'm greeted with 3 options. This one looks suspiciously like an oval to me, so I'll skip that. So I can choose between a 15-minute and 25-minute race. I love Laguna Seca, so I think I have to choose that. I then select my car from my garage, and immediately this is a huge departure from what I'm used to in iRacing, where races are not uncommonly comprised of a single model of car, or of a class of directly comparable cars, such as the GT3 or GT4 classes. In this GT7 race, the car class is Group 3, which is a very loose category of racing cars. Just from what I own, there's stuff from the 90s to even what is technically a concept car that never even went into mass production. The game then automatically balances the cars with horsepower reductions and weight increases or decreases. This is a pretty novel way of doing things, I suppose, and it certainly allows for the game's large car roster to actually get used in PvP competition. It's just not very realistic. So I pick the Lambo and I do a couple of qualifying laps, and I find myself in pole position for my first race. Nice. After a bit of warm-up, everyone lines up for the rolling start, and this is another area where things are very different from iRacing, where the formation laps and rolling starts are all fully player controlled. There's just an AI pace car that leads the field, and once it pulls into the pit, the leader is free to take off and start the race at any time until the light goes green. In GT7, it's fully hands-off, and players have no inputs until the race begins. But hang on, what's going on here? Half of the cars are Casper stands for some reason. The heads-up display is showing me as P2 when I'm clearly on pole, and for some bizarre reason, the race doesn't start when I cross the line. Instead, I just keep going until I've cleared the second corner. What the fuck? Judging by the minimap, it looks like P2 was AFK, so I immediately find myself 7 seconds in the lead, just a quarter way through the first lap. This really wasn't much of a race. Between the scuffed start and the lack of any resistance from the field, I won with an extremely comfortable 22-second lead over P2, earning me this delightful splash screen. I'm not even being sarcastic, I genuinely like these little flourishes of the game's personality. It's what Gran Turismo does best. That race wasn't a great first impression, but I'm as generous as I am handsome, so I sign up for another. I pick the Supra and I qualify on pole again. The formation lap actually works as intended this time, so I end up with something resembling a race, at least for a while. On the third lap, I messed up and overshot the corkscrew entry, and my main rival made a completely boneheaded dive bomb right into me, taking himself out with a complimentary rage quit right after. So again, I won by over 20 seconds. As much as it's a bit of an ego stroke to wail on Lobies, I don't think it's good racing or good content, so I'm going to try the longer race at Barcelona. I've never raced against people on this circuit before, and I'm far less comfortable on fast circuits like this compared to technical circuits like Laguna. I pick the Alpha and I qualify in 6th. As expected, I struggled a bit here. I don't really know what I'm doing at Catalunya, and I fumbled a few corners which lost me a lot of time. But then towards the end of the race, I started moving up the grid because a lot of the drivers were pitting. Get a load of these amateurs. Imagine needing to change your tyres on an 11-lap race. Ridiculous. So I ended up finishing in the top 3. Get wrecked, guy! Oh. I was supposed to pit, wasn't I? It turns out that I should have been paying attention to the session rules that are shown during sign-up, because there was, in fact, 1 mandatory pit stop and 4x tyre wear enabled, which would explain why my car felt like the Titanic those last few laps. I cop a 1-minute penalty for failing to pit, and my P3 becomes a P9. Whoops. But lesson learned, let's do another one. I return to Team Lambo and manage to qualify in P3. I get off to a pretty good start, picking up a position in my first lap and getting into first position by the end of lap 4. I'm feeling great about how this is going, so at the end of lap 5 I decide to get my pit stop out of the way, whilst also giving a live demonstration of how I picked my channel name.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
Putting aside my chronic skill issues, I'd say that was a track knowledge issue. I've never entered the pits here before. Though pitting is another notable difference between these two games. In iRacing, pit entry is completely manual. You'll need to slow down to the pit speed limit before crossing the entry line, otherwise you'll be penalised. If you're being competitive, it means you'll want to learn the braking zone for the pit entry as you would for any corner, otherwise you're leaving time on the table. Once you're in the pits, you manually drive to your crew, do your business, and leave manually as well. You're always in control. In Gran Turismo 7, you can yeet yourself into the pits as fast as you like, it literally doesn't matter. Once you're in, your car disappears from the race and you'll find yourself watching an instanced cutscene where you can pick your new tyres and decide whether or not to refuel and do repairs if needed. And once complete, you'll be spat out and reappear from another dimension into the pit exit where you'll regain control for re-entry. Needless to say, one of these is a hell of a lot more simulation than the other. So I finish my pit stop and I find I have a 3-second penalty to serve for crossing the pit line during my crash. And I actually kinda prefer the way GT7 handles slowdown penalties, with the designated slowdown zones that force you off the accelerator, compared to iRacing where you're given 30 seconds to serve your penalty. While this does allow for some strategy for when and where you decide to serve the slowdown, there's all sorts of weird jank that I don't really understand which causes the penalty to sometimes go up. It's infuriating when it happens. But on the other hand, in Gran Turismo, I don't exactly appreciate having my view of the road totally obscured by the penalty warning. I don't need to lose even more time here, dude. But after serving the penalty, I managed to drive consistently enough to finish in second, which I'm happy with. 2 golds and a silver is a good showing for my first day, so I'm looking forward to what races are on tomorrow. Alright, what are the daily races going to bring me today? this looks similar. It's almost as if they're exactly the same. Well, it turns out that the daily races, in fact, change weekly. I'm sorry, but how do you fuck that up? That'd be like if you had a TV show that you aired once a week and you called it The Daily Show. Who would do that? Outside of the naming, the reason that I assumed it was a daily rotation is because there's just the 3 races to choose from for the week, and that's it. I'm not opposed to the weekly format. That's how iRacing does it, and I think it works because people can actually learn the circuit and get some competitive racing going. The difference is that iRacing has far more than 3 races to choose from. There's tons of series representing different car classes from totally different racing disciplines, such as dedicated oval, dirt racing, multi-class, and endurance racing series. Despite lacking for choice and variety by direct comparison, there is some method to the madness here. GT7 is a popular game, so having the competitive multiplayer audience consolidated into these 3 races means that good granular matchmaking is practically guaranteed. And because the game has no DLC, there's no paywall-induced fragmentation of the player base. iRacing has a big problem with this. Because the paid content is so expensive, people are very reluctant to purchase unpopular cars and tracks, so that content can get caught in a popularity death spiral, even when it's an absolute giga-chad circuit like Knock Hill. In any case, I continued doing some more races and managed to pull out some more decent results until the week ticked over and we finally got new dailies. Group 3 and 4 again at Monza and Deep Forest. Now, fantasy tracks. Obviously these aren't present in iRacing, and I kinda have mixed feelings about them in Gran Turismo. It's a good way for the developer to expand the game's track lineup without having to license or scan as many real-world locations. And because it's such a long-running series, these tracks are now iconic in their own right, so they're a unique selling point for the game. But, if I'm being honest, and this will be controversial, I feel like the fantasy tracks are a bit mid. They're never my first choice when I compare them to circuits like Bathurst or Road Atlanta, which are among my all-time favourites. I think they lack the character of real-world locations, like they're a bit too idealised and perfect in a way that makes them feel very gamey, and less appealing to me as a result. I don't really like spending time finding racing pace on them either, because that knowledge and time investment doesn't transfer over to any other game, as it does with real-world locations. It's not an issue if GT is your main thing, but for me it was a bit off-putting. Some other observations. In iRacing, it is mandatory to race from the cockpit view in the official races, which I'm a fan of as I ordinarily prefer the cockpit camera. However, GT7's cockpit camera severely lacks for adjustability, so I actually kind of appreciated that I didn't have to use it here. When other drivers receive a slowdown penalty, you'll see it above their car and even a countdown timer when it's about to be served, which I think is kinda nice so that you can make a plan to go for an overtake. In GT7, qualifying times last for the entire week, so you don't have to do it more than once if you don't want to, whereas in iRacing, qualifying only counts for that single race, which is definitely more realistic and means drivers need to be consistent in their qualifying efforts if they want to keep starting up the front. The other implication of this is that the weather conditions in GT7's daily races don't seem to vary as much as they do in iRacing from session to session. Car setup options in the daily races are pretty limited compared to the open series in iRacing, where players can tinker with setup much more extensively. iRacing's official series operate on 12-week seasons, with the full schedule published at the start. This allows you to know what's coming weeks in advance, so if there's a car and track combo that you're particularly keen or not keen on, you can plan accordingly. With GT7, you can find out what's scheduled for next week's daily races, but beyond that, it's not public knowledge. GT7 has directly integrated livery creation and sharing, which is very convenient compared to iRacing Solution, which is a third-party website and app called Trading Paints. GT7 has a ghosting system, which seems to be intended to prevent other players from being caught up in incidents that they didn't cause, though the criteria for when a car will become ghosted seems a little unclear, so it is hard to predict, and I don't think it teaches players good accident avoidance. GT7 also teleports players back on track during major off-track incidents, instead of allowing players to rejoin manually as they do in iRacing. I believe the intention of this is to prevent players from taking large cuts, but the way it's been implemented leads to some incredible bullshit. Take this for instance. I'm driving the white, black and gold Porsche up ahead. The Mercedes decides there is probable cause to search my rear cavity.
Oh my ass!
I get ghosted and spun out by the other car that I was shunted into, and in the process of turning around to rejoin, I inadvertently drive over a no-no zone, which teleports me back to the start of the corner. This wouldn't be an honest video if I didn't touch on the driving standards, which are, look, in any ranked online racing game where you're starting at the bottom and working your way up, you're going to see some shit. It's inevitable, and iRacing is no exception to this. But degrees of severity does matter, and I found that the process of wading through Gran Turismo's idiots was significantly more painful than wading through iRacing's idiots. I started to feel a bit gaslit by the experience. It made me question if I was remembering my first season in iRacing with rose-tinted glasses, so I went back and I watched a bunch of those replays, but no, it really was better. Stupid things happened, of course, and maybe I just got lucky, but there was far less malicious behaviour and simply more noobs making silly mistakes while learning. I certainly did my fair share of that. This got me wondering about why this was the case. What is it about iRacing that makes the drivers behave themselves just a little bit better at those lower levels? And I think the answer is consequences. GT7's damage system is a great example. The daily races seem to use the light damage setting, which means that damage magically repairs itself over time. I thought I was going crazy when I first noticed this. Compare this to iRacing, where full damage is always enabled in official races. If you have any sort of high-speed differential crash, you are likely to be completely obliterated. This directly incentivizes drivers to be more careful around one another. In iRacing, all new players have to graduate from the rookies in their respective license category, which means you've got to cut your teeth for at least a few races in a slow car before you can move on to faster stuff. It's something of a rite of passage, and there's no shortage of YouTube videos documenting it. Whereas in GT7, players are jumping straight into GT3 cars right from the word go. Starting off with slower cars is worthwhile because incidents happen more slowly, which gives you more time to judge what's going on around you and hopefully avoid it. You also can't report reckless or unsportsmanlike behaviour in GT7. iRacing has dedicated stewards on staff so that you can protest incidents, which will be manually reviewed, and if wrongdoing is found, the offender will be informed, coached and/or punished on a case-by-case basis, depending on the severity of the incident and that person's history of protested incidents. Even though the protest outcomes are confidential, I know that a lot of iRacers strongly suspect that the stewards are too lenient, and I'm not completely naive. I'm aware of the conflict of interest for a service like iRacing to ban paying customers, and that some people are just immune to good advice. But I also think that most people, if they're told by an actual authority figure, hey, that's against the rules, please don't do that, they will at least try to do better next time. It's obviously not 100% effective, but I do think it helps. I don't expect Gran Turismo to have this kind of service. It wouldn't be feasible for a one-time purchase game like this. But I think all of these things add up and at least partially explain the overarching driving standards problem that GT7 has. Without radically changing the game's core design, here's what I think Polyphony should do about it. Firstly, adjust the safety rating brackets so that an S rating is a bit more elusive. I'm not saying that it should be the hardest thing in the world to get, but I found it shockingly easy to attain and hold an S rating. For perspective, I have an A license in iRacing, and I'd say that GT7's S rating is roughly comparable to a C license in iRacing, so I think it's pretty laughable that it's the top tier that you can get. Secondly, a fourth race should be added to the Dailies that requires an S safety rating to participate in. This is where Gran Turismo's economy system would be perfect to sell this to the player base.
Fuck this shit!
You could significantly boost the XP and credit rewards for that S daily race, and maybe reward players with a 6-star roulette ticket once per week for completing one of those races, or something along those lines. Make it lucrative for the player to have an S safety rating, incentivize and motivate your players to be clean and safe in the multiplayer, and more of them will. You don't have to look far to see some of the mind-numbingly repetitive shit that some GT players resort to just to farm credits. So surely you could redirect that energy into players learning some actual racecraft and self-preservation. It would do the multiplayer scene a lot of good. There is a light at the end of the tunnel though. I noticed that once I got to a B driver rating, where the matchmaking was pairing me with B and A class drivers, the driving cleaned up noticeably and the racing was more enjoyable. This actually mirrors what I've seen in iRacing as well. In the sports cars, I hover around 2400 iRating, which is nothing special. The deficiencies in my skill are too numerous to count, but it's good enough that it puts me firmly on the side of the bell curve that you want to be on. And the greatest reward of this, by far, is that the driving you're subjected to is at least decent, and you can enjoy some good, clean multi-lap battles. There's clearly very, very, very good drivers in GT7's multiplayer scene, so there's a high skill ceiling for the rest of us mere earthlings to grow into here. Unfortunately, getting a B ranking was also where a new irritation started to set in, as I found myself at the limits of what I could do with a controller. I'm sure there's tons of A and A+ drivers using controllers, but I will never be one of them. If I want to be faster, and more importantly, consistenter, I need a wheel. So I'm sure you can imagine my frustration at not being able to use the perfectly good Fanatec direct drive setup that is sitting right next to me, all because it isn't PlayStation compatible. And why isn't it compatible? Well, it's for the same reason that the PS5 supports video output at 1440p, my monitor's native resolution, yet I can't record at 1440p, even though the PS5 can record at 4K. It's because consoles are fucking stupid, that's why. They're just computers, and they can interface with USB devices like any other computer. The "fuck you, pay me" policy that dictates peripheral compatibility is one of the biggest reasons that the PC continues to be the best platform for simulators of all genres, despite modern console hardware actually being otherwise quite capable. After 4 years, the base PS5 is actually quite comparable to the most common PC specs in the Steam hardware surveys. It's not a slow machine, but this walled garden crap completely kneecaps its usefulness for racing sims. This isn't Gran Turismo's fault, of course. It's not an intrinsic flaw of the game, but it is an intrinsic flaw of the platform it's stuck on. From where I'm sitting, it would be a much better experience with a PC port. I'd be having so much more fun if I could actually utilise my wheel and ultra-wide monitor. If you have to segregate the multiplayer to keep the PlayStation isolationist happy, fine, I don't mind. But the fact is that Forza Motorsport's negative reputation still precedes it. And Assetto Corsa Evo's hype has proven that there's demand on PC for racing games with similar features to Gran Turismo. I think it would do well, but like I said, it's one of the last feathers in Sony's cap, so I doubt it will ever happen. Console kvetching aside, what did I think, all things considered? After all of my criticisms, you might be expecting me to say that it's the worst game ever, but no, I don't think that's true. With any game, you've got to keep in mind what it's trying to do and who it's actually aimed at, and Gran Turismo clearly isn't going after the no-life simulation nerds. It's meant as a beginner-accessible driving simulator, or simcade, that intentionally makes a number of compromises to its realism in order to be player-friendly. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I can absolutely see this being an appealing route for somebody to enter online competitive racing. It's not expensive to buy, you don't need expensive hardware to run it, or even a wheel to participate, and it's certainly easy on the eyes. Even for more seasoned players, I can believe that it would strike the right balance for certain types of people. But when you have the gall to market a game like this with the tagline, "The Real Driving Simulator," you're practically inviting unfavourable comparison. Despite a few things that I genuinely appreciated about it, I wasn't particularly satisfied with it. To be honest, I'm probably never going to touch GT7's multiplayer ever again, but I don't regret trying it. The reasons that I didn't like it could very well be the reasons that you do like it. Horses for courses. I'll stick with the thoroughbred, and you can have all the fun you like with the pony. A final note, I know I'm not the first person to make this comparison. Suellio Almeida did a video a while back where he went in depth into the differences between the car handling and force feedback. He's an immensely better driver than me, with real life experience, and he actually had a PlayStation wheel setup, so he's far more qualified to talk about that subject. Really good video, highly recommend watching it. And with that, thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe even learnt something. I certainly had fun doing this, it was a nice change of pace. Maybe you'd like to see me suffer through Forza Motorsport next time. Be sure to let me know what a pretentious elitist wanker I am in the comments, and to like, subscribe and hit that bell, or consider sharing the video with someone who would enjoy it. Happy thumb twiddling, and until next time, always remember, Willow Springs Neoclassical Challenge is the worst race ever. and I'm suing Polyphony for my pain and suffering.